Good afternoon, everybody. My apologies for keeping you waiting. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and it gives me great pleasure to invite you to this public lecture here. I think those of you who've been here before know that it's a tradition for me to make 3 points in my introduction. So I'll quickly, because we don't have much time with our distinguished speaker today, I'll make 3 quick points. The first point, of course, is that about the importance of trade. And here, frankly, if you look at the history of the last 50 years, if you want to understand why living standards around the world have grown so much, there's a direct linkage between economic welfare and trade. And I'll just give you some statistics. The World Bank found in the 1990s that the increase of trade to GDP ratios made an increase of 5% of income per capita for about 3 billion people. That's significant. The IMF and the World Bank published a joint paper 2002 that said welfare gains from eliminating trade barriers range from 250 billion to 650 billion. And the former Director General of WTO, Mike Moore, once said, cutting barriers to trade would be like adding 2 more Chinas to the world economy. That's why trade is important. And that's why it's very important to have one of the world's most significant figures on trade, the Commissioner for Trade from the European Union, addressing us today. My second point is about the European Union. And as you know, traditionally, it has been the United States and European Union that has provided the global leadership for the opening up of the global trading system. In fact, in general, you could say that the liberal global trading system is a gift from the United States and European Union to the world. And that's why continuing European leadership in this area is very important. And here, if I may share a concern with you, Mr. Commissioner, one of the concerns this region has is how strongly committed remains the European Union to opening up trade, and therefore a visit by someone like you today is a very timely one. My third and final point is a very short one, because I think you already know how distinguished our speaker is. But I want to emphasize, and I'm going to first of all apologize to him. I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce it correct. But Professor Karel de Gucht, comme ci, comme ça, I did a very bad job, is a model for our students, because he was, in fact, a significant student leader and a significant player in his student days, and then rose to play a role in municipal politics, national politics, became Minister for International Trade, Minister for Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, and also Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium. And today, of course, as you all know, he holds one of the most significant jobs in the world. In some ways, you can say that if you hold the job of European Commissioner of Trade, you're actually going to determine the course of world history. And that's why it's a great privilege to have you here. Welcome, please. Over to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, Mr. Dean. It is, in fact, a great pleasure to me to be here today as Asia's premier public policy institute and to have a chance to address this eminent audience. It's only 18 months ago since I last visited Singapore in my previous capacity as Belgium's Foreign Minister. I have found that if you stay away longer than that, you hardly recognize the city, and I am particularly pleased to be here again, as I realize that on a number of global issues, we share a similar outlook. Importantly, both Europe and Singapore see trade and investment as a crucial element in the global recovery, which is a necessary condition for resuming our own growth. As public policy specialists, you will know as well as I do that economists often disagree on what caused the financial crisis. But they do see eye to eye on one point, that free trade makes the world better off. Yet, in spite of its benefits, trade is often an extremely contentious political issue, both domestically and between governments. The British historian Thomas Macaulay was thinking of this paradox when he said that free trade, one of the greatest blessings which a government can confer on a people, is in almost every country unpopular. That was back in 1824, yet today it still rings true. Open markets are still under pressure. International competition is still seen as a source of unemployment and impoverishment, and trade in itself is still all too often seen as unfair. The challenge for us policymakers is therefore clear. At a time when trade is often seen as one of the things that got us into the crisis, we have to turn around this idea, and support international trade is to get us out of the crisis. Today's launch of free trade negotiations between the European Union and Singapore should be viewed in that perspective. It shows that not only do we agree on the principles, we are willing and able to put them in practice as well. The proposed free trade agreement marks a new beginning in our bilateral relations. It will strengthen economic ties between Singapore and the EU, provide new opportunities for traders and consumers alike, and contribute to generating growth in our economies. For Europe, it will also mark an important stepping stone in the EU's engagement with the ASEAN region. To underline the importance of these negotiations, let us briefly recall the events of the last year. When you celebrated the arrival of the year of the ox 12 months ago, global economic confidence was at its lowest in the wake of the Lehman Brothers collapse and its aftershocks. Financial markets had plummeted, sending shockwaves through many of our largest banks and causing some of them to crumble. The financial crisis then took a heavy toll on the real economy, setting off a chain of job losses. International trade drives economic growth, but it also suffers heavily in recession, and we saw a drop of around 10% in world trade in 2009. 1 year on, as the year of the tiger dawns, we may not be out of the woods yet, but things look decidedly better. I believe this is in good part the result of a determined response from many governments. Europe has played a key part in stimulating the global recovery. It is estimated that the EU is spending some 5% of its GDP on fiscal measures, including automatic stabilizers such as unemployment benefits and other social security payments. A large part of these funds are, at any rate, earmarked for future-oriented spending, for instance, broadband infrastructure and green technologies. The EU has also been at the forefront of global efforts over the last period to avert the risks of a protectionist spiral, both by what we did and by what we did not. Thanks to the strength of our internal market discipline, our borders have been kept open for business and foreign investment kept flowing. Europe has not wavered on its commitment to free trade and will not do so in the future. We have also supported the excellent monitoring work of the WTO in preparing the regular reports on protectionist measures. We have always advocated that transparency is a crucial element for building confidence among the trading community, and confidence was exactly what was missing in the past year. We have argued for and obtained strong political statements by the G20 against protectionism and in favour of completing the DDA, stressing its potential value as the best single way of addressing protectionist risks at the global level. and we have exercised restraint domestically, even in difficult economic and political circumstances. Globally, WTO rules have provided insurance against a protectionist race to the bottom. And it is no coincidence that it is in the area of government procurement, where WTO rules are not universal, where we have seen some protectionist slippage. On balance, it is fair to say that the multilateral rules-based system has passed its worst stress test yet. Given our economic openness, it is not surprising that Singapore and the EU remain fully committed to the WTO and in particular to completing the Doha round of trade talks. We work together in the WTO to secure a balanced and comprehensive Doha deal which would not only favour a quick and smooth recovery by injecting a significant boost to the global economy, but would address long-standing concerns of developing countries, notably on agriculture. However, the current deadlock on Doha should not put our wider vision on hold. The free trade negotiations that we envisage are part of an effort to boost our economies by freeing up trade and investment in areas that are currently beyond the reach of the World Trade Organization. They are part of an effort to make trade work for our economies at a time when they need the boost. And they are also part of an effort to make trade be seen to work for the benefit of our citizens, whose faith in open markets is dwindling. It takes confidence to open up international competition, a professor you all know very well once remarked, and diminishing confidence in the West results in less openness. I'm sure Professor Mahbubani will agree with me on this, that the negotiations we are launching today are a step in restoring that confidence, based on a firmly held conviction that international trade and global competition are not a zero-sum game. It is in this spirit that we are negotiating with a view to establishing a forward-looking free trade agreement between two like-minded partners, convinced that both stand to win as a result of it. The objective of our FTA negotiations is simple. We wish to create new opportunities for business from both sides. Companies wishing to sell goods or offering services between the two sides should enjoy preferential treatment, and consumers should get access to a wider variety of products at better prices. The economic foundations for further strengthening our trade ties are strong. Today, the European Union is Singapore's largest trading partner and foreign investor. Bilateral trade in goods and services exceeded 55 billion euros in 2008. Singapore is the EU's foremost trading partner among the Southeast Asian countries. About one-third of EU-ASEAN trade is with Singapore. Besides trade, our bilateral investment ties are robust. We have invested a total of 100 billion euros in each other's economies over the years. Our investment relationship is a two-way street. Today, dockers in the port of Antwerp benefit from Singaporean investments, just as Singaporeans working in the pharma business, maintaining aircraft, or selling financial services benefit from the presence of European investors in Singapore, where some 3,400 EU companies have set up subsidiaries. I am keen to further promote the EU to investors of Singapore, including its sovereign wealth funds. I explicitly wish to acknowledge the progress made over the last years in response to calls for enhanced transparency and accountability. For the EU, Singapore represents a growing market for exports and investments, as well as a crucial link to the wider ASEAN region. European companies who are thinking about setting up shop in one of the ASEAN countries may well be encouraged by the FTA to do so in Singapore. FTAs in many cases promote bilateral investment. Likewise, it makes eminent sense for Singapore to get preferential access to the EU, the world's largest market. The EU, with its 500 million of largely prosperous consumers, is without doubt an attractive destination for Singaporean exports. I think it's fitting that my first official trip outside Europe as Commissioner for Trade has taken me to Asia, Vietnam, Singapore and India, a region which accounts for an increasing share of the EU's trade. To put in perspective, our total trade with Asia last year amounted to 730 billion, compared to 426 for the combined NAFTA countries. On many issues, Asia and Europe are natural partners. We have common interests on a range of issues, be it maintaining an open trading system, tackling environmental challenges, deepening regional integration, or reducing imbalances in the global economy. We realize we have to work on these together, and we do. The launch of FTA negotiations with Singapore for us marks the beginning of a deeper engagement with Asia, and in particular in our relations with the ASEAN region. Although Singapore is the first one in, our door remains open for other ASEAN countries interested in negotiating a comprehensive free trade agreement with us. We are not available to do shallow FTAs, but we will be mindful of differences in levels of development. I feel encouraged by the signals I'm getting from certain ASEAN capitals. The EU also remains interested in further strengthening ties with the ASEAN group beyond free trade agreement negotiations. This is not only because we have a soft spot for regional integration processes elsewhere. It's also because ASEAN has the potential to play an increasingly important role on the global scene. With the ASEAN Charter and the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint, ASEAN has set itself ambitious goals. The EU has been a long-time supporter of this process. We will continue to do so, and as a regional group, you can always count on a sympathetic ear in Brussels. Nobody else knows and understands the challenges of regional integration as well as we do. This is as much a political as it is a technical process. Granted, so all regional integration processes are different, and lessons from one process cannot automatically be applied to a different context. But I think that there is a case for comparing notes, for sharing experiences and discussing best practices, for example on regulatory matters. This is our daily bread in the EU. I would be happy to explore with you, with my counterparts here in the region, whether there is interest in sharing our respective experiences in a more structured manner. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Asia's re-emergence has rightly captured the world's attention. Tectonic power shifts are taking place right before our eyes, and you are well placed here in Singapore at the heart of ASEAN to benefit from these changes. The success of many Southeast Asian economies is an example of how development based on opening one's doors to foreign trade and investment can lead to prosperity. I have heard that Deng Xiaoping, the architect of China's economic reforms, preferred the advice of Minister Mentor Kuan Yew to that of his own officials, who told him reform and opening up would never work in China. Small wonder that the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy has started a course to train Chinese public service officials. Now China, but also India and other Asian countries, is catching up fast. Notwithstanding Asia's growing economic success, today Europe has a predominant role in the world economy. Out of a world GDP worth 41 trillion euros, the EU's 12.5 trillion economy, compared with China 3 trillion, is the world's largest. we are also the biggest importer and exporter, as well as the main source and destination of foreign direct investment. So Europe will remain an attractive partner for Asia. Over the last 20 years, Europeans created a single market, a common currency, and a border-free travelling area. We swiftly integrated 12 mostly former communist economies, bringing the EU's total population to 500 million, a similar proportion to ASEAN. Now we are tackling the next big projects. As a matter of fact, as we speak, the Commission is issuing its communication on the Europe 2020 strategy, laying out its vision on how the EU can achieve a more sustainable, smarter and greener economy in the next 10 years. In particular, I want to stress that this vision includes openness and growth. Europe 2020 is about an open Europe in a globalized world, where a rules-based international framework is the best way to exploit growth and employment opportunities. Of course, Europe 2020 goes well beyond trade, but at the same time it sets out the broader framework for a European trade strategy that the Commission will draw up in the coming months. Asia has benefited greatly from Europe's success, especially in the trade and economic sphere. Last year we demonstrated our commitment to Asia by initialing an ambitious free trade agreement with Korea. That agreement has set a new benchmark. I am optimistic that the future EU-Singapore free trade agreement will match that benchmark, even surpass it. Today, Minister Lim and I have opened a new chapter in our relations. In my view, establishing a free trade agreement is a means to an end. That end is encouraging more and more beneficial economic partnerships and forging closer people-to-people links. Ordinary European and Singaporean citizens should be the ultimate beneficiaries of the decision taken today to deepen our bilateral relations. I trust they will enjoy soon the fruits of our labour. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that optimistic message. I hope you don't mind if I take advantage of my position as chair to ask you the first question. I completely agree with you that the world global trading system has survived a major stress test. And it's actually quite amazing how well it has survived. But at the same time, there's also no doubt that the political consensus in favor of free trade has actually been weakened in many countries. And just to use the United States as an example, with unemployment running at close to 10%, no leader can go to the US Congress and say, ratify the US-Korea FTA, ratify the US-Colombia FTA. In a sense, FTAs now are politically dead in the water. So what do we need to do to rebuild the political consensus in favor of free trade?
Well, it reminds me of my starting period in politics. I happened to be a liberal. I still am. But at that moment in time, to call yourself a liberal was not really hot in the political market. You should rather be ashamed that you were a liberal at that moment in time. But my generation started by saying very openly, we are liberals, and we are liberals because we are convinced that this is the best political option. And we continued saying so. And after 10 years, we got the first liberal prime minister in Belgium for more than a century. So you also have to be convinced of your own ideas. And when you say that no American political leader can go to Congress and ask for the ratification of the free trade agreement with South Korea or with Colombia, well, then they are simply making a mistake, and a big mistake. They should go to Parliament and they should defend it. I will also have to go to the European Parliament for the free trade agreement with Korea. And it will also be criticized. For example, the duty drawback system is heavily criticized by the automotive industry, although the impact is, I think, marginal. But it will be heavily criticized. We concluded during the weekend, just before my arrival in Vietnam, we concluded the free trade negotiations with Colombia and with Peru. Colombia will be criticized in the European Parliament as well, not merely, I think, for the economics of the agreement, but because of political reasons which have to do with the trade unionists in Colombia. But we did the agreement, and now I'm going to face the criticism of the European Parliament, and I'm quite confident that we will overcome the criticism and that we will get it approved. But of course you can never convince somebody if you are not convinced yourself and if you are afraid of your own arguments. It was very interesting to read the State of the Union by President Obama, who said that his goal is to double trade, American trade, within 5 years. Now, honestly speaking, I don't see how he will be doing that with a protectionist policy. If he wants to have a chance to get this through, and I think it would be good for the world economy as such, you know, then he will have to reason in terms of open markets and not in terms of protectionism.
Great. Please stand up. If you don't mind, identify yourself and then quick, short, sharp questions.
Hi, Deborah Elms, Temasek Foundation Center for Trade and Negotiations in Singapore. My question has to do with the costs of doing bilateral agreements. The EU and ASEAN have been working on a FTA for quite some time. It isn't going anywhere. The solution seems to be to switch to bilaterals, first with Vietnam. You launched negotiations with Singapore today. And my question is, what gets lost from the EU's perspective in pursuing bilateral agreements rather than regional agreements? Thanks.
Well, as I already mentioned in my address, Singapore makes up for 1/3 of the trade with ASEAN countries. It's quite impressive. And I wouldn't call it a second best solution. You know, what we have been doing the last 50 years in Europe is, I think, quite a spectacular example of regional integration. In fact, the only one that has happened on the planet. When you look to regional integration in other parts of the world, it's still in its childhood. But it also means that Europe maybe looks a little bit too easily at the world in terms of regions. We are facing exactly the same problem with our economic partnerships agreements in Africa. We also think about Africa in terms of regions. Now, I happen to know Africa rather well, so I'm a little bit, how would I say, more careful about this analysis. But you have a tendency to reason in your own categories, and the category of Europe is, of course, regional integration. Now, looking at the situation as it is in ASEAN, you are on the road to regional integration. But the mere question is, how do you get there? And probably the better way is to have bilateral free trade agreements, but deep free trade agreements to set the pace, make a canvas of that kind of agreements, and ultimately come to a region-to-region approach. So rather taking it the reverse way. That would be my analysis of the problem, and that's in any case the way that we will be going forward in the next period.
Thank you. Now I'm pleased to introduce to you a professor from the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy who comes from Belgium. We have professors from Belgium, but not students from Belgium yet.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner de Gucht. We wish you and EU and Singapore all success in the negotiations. You mentioned the sovereign wealth funds and that they have been invited to contribute to investment in the European Union. If we read their documents, looking forward, they have actually announced that their plan is to increase significantly the share of their investments geared towards Asia. Basically because the growth prospects are so much stronger. That does not mean that in absolute amounts they could not increase their investments in Europe. The question that I have is, looking forward for the next decade, how do you see economic growth rates in Europe? There are some very positive features on the research and development side. On the other hand, there are also factors that weigh very heavily on Europe. Public finances are strained, aging populations is difficult to keep labor costs competitive. So the question I ask is, how will preferential access to Singapore in the European Union help overcome some of those structural impediments?
Well, first of all, on the sovereign wealth funds, the reason I put this in my address is that in some European countries there is some reluctance to see investments by sovereign wealth funds. And we see sovereign wealth funds, and we are in Singapore, the sovereign wealth funds from Singapore as very professional investors who have an added value for the company they are investing in. So we see them as very important investment providers also in the future in our own economies. That the sovereign wealth funds are investing more than in the past in their neighborhood, it's quite normal. But I'm quite sure that Europe will not be left out for a lot of reasons that I mentioned in my introduction, because in the end it's a very interesting market of about 500 million prosperous citizens. You don't find that everywhere around the corner. Now, about Europe, I'm not that pessimistic about Europe. For several reasons. We of course have an aging population. By the way, that will also come in Asia. It already starts to come in this country, for example, because your birth rate is very low. China is going to face that within a generation at the latest. So this will come also in other parts of the world. And speaking in terms of growth, it is often said that China, for example, needs 8% of growth to guarantee the stability in the country. We don't need that. I mean, imagine that in Europe we would have an annual growth of even 5% for 5 consecutive years. It would create a terrible overheating of the economy. Probably what would be better is that our medium-term growth, underlying growth, would be higher than it is now. We are about 1.5, 1.7. That's too little. That's obvious. That's also the reason why we have been launching this EU 2020 initiative, so that we can boost the underlying growth. But I think we would be very happy with 2.5, and we would also do very well with 2.5. And I think this is feasible. It is certainly feasible. You mentioned some reasons, for example, our breakthroughs in research. What we should be better at than in the future is to translate our research breakthroughs in actual products. In microtechnology, for example, all the major breakthroughs have been made in Europe, but the products are produced in Asia and to a certain extent in the US. I mean, that's what we should learn something from that. But I'm not at all that pessimistic. And I have been reading, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, a very critical article by Mr. Wabani on Europe.
Thank you for this free advertising.
Well, you will have to pay for it, you know. And I completely disagree with it. Completely disagree with it, because they are saying, look, you have been negotiating for 9 years on the Lisbon Treaty. First of all, the text that comes out after 9 years is hardly differing from the original text, which means that we held the line. Europe is the only example of a regional integration that works. In certain aspects, we are even more integrated than the US, for example, for financial services. We take all our decisions, or almost all of our decisions, and all economic decisions, we take them by majority. We are very close to what you would call a state. A lot of states on the world who are much less integrated than the European Union. I'm not calling it a nation, because we are a state made of nations, but we are very close to the status of state. We don't like to call it ourselves like that, but when you look at the dynamics, the political dynamics, the economic dynamics, even the monetary dynamics, we are very close to that. Look at the financial crisis. We resisted that financial crisis pretty well. I remember a very interesting discussion with the number 2 of Geithner, who was telling me, imagine that Unicredit had gone bankrupt, what would you have done? And I answered him, look, it's not Unicredit that went bankrupt, it was Lehman Brothers, no? And so the ECB did very well during the financial crisis. We have now a problem with Greece. We will resolve that problem. So to be, it's a little bit fashionable to be critical about Europe. I would like that it's fashionable to be critical for everybody.
Thank you. Ambassador of Brazil.
Thank you. Mr. Karel de Gucht, taking account that you just mentioned a few minutes ago that the European Union tends to think by categories, I would like to hear your perception about the evolution or the non-evolution of the lagging and dragging negotiations for a free trade agreement between the European Union and the Mercosur countries, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay.
Can I also know who you are, sir?
The ambassador
of Brazil here.
You're the ambassador from Brazil.
Yeah.
Then it's even a more interesting question. But I asked it before because I had already a sense that you could be an ambassador from one of those 2 countries. Yeah. We hope that we can relaunch the negotiations with Mercosur before the summit between the European Union and LAC, so the Latin American countries, which is to take place somewhere in May, if my recollection is good. I would argue that the responsibility is at least on both sides. You have differences of opinion between Brazil and Argentina. I hope they are vanishing. That's what I'm told, that now there is much more of an agreement between the 2 countries. It's also a discussion on the level of ambition that we want to have in such a free trade agreement. And there the position of the European Union is that we should have high ambitions with this. Also because we are still very staunch believers, and will remain to do so, of a multilateral approach. So we should not undermine a possible Doha deal. So we need an ambitious free trade agreement. But we are ready to engage, provided that we can agree on the terms of such a negotiation. And before the summit meeting, I will certainly have talks with your government and with the government of Argentina, and also with the Spanish presidency, to see how we can unblock the situation. But it's certainly, I think it would be a little bit unfair to say that this is the responsibility of Europe alone.
Okay, we have next question. Please introduce yourself to the Commissioner.
Thank you, sir. I'm Sunshine from China, MPV senior in Li Kuan School. My question is that if I change one word in the topic, I change the Singapore to China, will you change the word partners? And if that, how? Simple question.
Europe and China,
Yeah.
partners in trade, partners for growth.
Yeah,
what
yeah.
would you say?
I would also be in favor of that. By the way, there is a high-level economic dialogue between the European Union and China. We will have the next meeting at the end of April. I think it's very important to engage with China even beyond free trade talks. How can we resolve economic disputes between us? It's even not a question whether we see China as an important trading partner or not. It is a very important trading partner, and it will become an ever-increasing trading partner. And I also see China as a main provider of foreign direct investment in Europe in the years to come. I would argue that maybe the difference in appraisal for China and for trading relations with China is that Europe, and sometimes we are blamed for that, does see this much less under the angle of geostrategical, how would I say, designs, you know. We are of the opinion that freeing trade with economic partners is as such a good and is as such benefiting to both nations. That has always been our approach, and as Mr. Muabani said in his introduction, in fact, free trade is a gift from the United States and Europe to the rest of the world, and we are still very much convinced of that. So I have no problem changing the word Singapore into China at all, but it doesn't mean that we are then getting away from Singapore. It just means that we are adding China.
Just a quick follow-on question on that. You know, if you look at China, U.S.-China relations, which are going through a very delicate phase now, you have Tibet, you have Taiwan, but most importantly, you have the value of the yuan that seems to become a big political issue in the United States. Is the value of the yuan also a big issue in Europe too?
Yep. We have been saying exactly the same, that the Chinese currency is undervalued, and we hope that in the months to come, yuan will appreciate. As far as the two other remarks are concerned, I'm not sure that the relations between the U.S. and China are in such heavy waters. I mean, it's not the first time that we see, for example, what now happened, the arms deal between the U.S. and Taiwan. And also in the past, there was heavy criticism when this happened, and nevertheless it went through. Tibet is not a new issue either. It's not the first president of the U.S. who has been receiving the Dalai Lama. You could even argue that the previous one received him with more, how would I say, decorum than the present one. So I don't think that this, as such, has fundamentally altered the relationship between the U.S. and China. But of course, they are both geostrategical players. That's obvious. But that we would be facing a dangerous, quote unquote, period in this relationship. I tend to disagree on that.
Thank you. Next question.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm a student from the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Just one short question. Just now you said that free trade, you still believe that free trade is a free gift to the rest of the world. But some economists, the prominent economists such as Stiglitz, he actually argued that free trade can be too free. And he argued for a fairer trade regime, right? And he said the advanced economies should perhaps lower the tariff and also eliminate the huge subsidies to the farming industry and help the poorer countries to develop their domestic institutions first before demanding them to open up their market. So what is your comment on that? Thank you.
I think that the picture is a little bit more complicated. When you look, for example, at the relationship, also the commercial relationship between Europe and Africa, it's not really about subsidies, you know. That's not what is hampering trade between Africa and the European Union, because most of those countries are LDCs, least developed countries, and they have duty-free, quota-free, and the so-called everything but arms. It's much more about the ability to produce products that they can export. I think it's much more about that, and that's why the whole chapter on aid for trade is very important. And there is also, I wouldn't call it hypocrisy, but it's also a little bit too easy to criticize all the time the Northern Hemisphere, you know, because trade South-South is also not a perfect example of what should happen. Huh? The tariffs, when we are very staunch supporters of the Doha round, and we were even ready to go further. I remember the negotiations in Hong Kong in 2006, and Europe was prepared to go further by lowering our tariffs towards Africa and allowing them to keep their tariffs rather high. Huh? So maybe I'm limiting the problem to Africa, but I think it is the sticky point at this moment in time. It is. And really, I think that Africa has to come to grips with itself also. In terms of governance, for example, I mean, we have, Europe, I don't know the exact figure, but we have been pouring in tens of billions of euros in ODA, official development aid, and look at what is the result. In Asia, very little money has been poured in, but look at the result. I mean, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. I don't believe that you can develop, be it a country or a continent, without developing an economy, without developing trade. I don't believe that. It's not by simply helping people that they will get out of poverty. They also have to put their act together. So I'm a little bit critical about Africa because I love this continent, and I'm very sorry that in fact they do not manage this start of that the rest of the world has been able to make.
Okay, as usual, towards the end, there are 3 questions at the end, but I'm going to take, if you don't mind, can I take all 3, and then you can respond to them?
I can give it a try.
Yeah, so first one, second one, third one. Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. My name is Tomohiro Oya, MPP student from Japan. My question is that one of the biggest bottleneck to promoting the FTA would be the agricultural sector, which is politically very conservative, and compared to the GDP share, agriculture sector is minimal in the developed world. Still, they are strong impact towards the decision-making process. So do you have any implications to promote FTA and come up with the agricultural sector program? Thank you.
First question. Second question.
Jörg Reding, ambassador from Switzerland. The Dean likes provocative questions, so I might ask a provocative. Are you using...
But Switzerland is not provocative, though.
Not at all. Are you losing your time in putting resources for negotiation with a country like Singapore, where on the good sides there is not a lot of scope to negotiate, even in the non-barrier sectors? There are a number of issues, certainly in the service sectors, but even there, and I know we have Switzerland in the frame of EFTA, we have had a free trade agreement for many years with Singapore, and even in the service sectors, the scope to negotiate is relatively limited. Are you seeing the free trade agreement between the US and Singapore as a kind of benchmark when it comes into the service sector, specifically financial services? And what's the scope of the free trade agreement? Do you go beyond? Are you also here to discuss tax issues like exchange of information on tax topics? Thank you very much.
That was a real question. And the last question.
I'm Stanley Chang. I was the marketing consultant for EU and ASEAN during Mr. Chris Patton's era, 3 years in Thailand and 1 year in Indonesia. My question is that, Mr. Commissioner, what is some of the changes that you might bring that is different from your predecessors? That's my question.
Good question. Okay. 3 questions for you.
First, about the agricultural sector. Yes, this is, it's always part of our defensives, and that we see that in free trade negotiations. I think there are several reasons for that. The number of people still active in that sector is rather limited. In Europe, in certain parts of Europe, you have very big differences between, let's say, the traditional member states and the new member states. You have in former Eastern European areas still countries where you have a considerable percentage of people active in agriculture, and also, how would I say, not agriculture which is necessarily industrially oriented, and so it's quite different from one country to another. I think there are at least a couple of psychological reasons. The fact that in the previous generation, most of our parents were active in the agricultural sector, so this is something that we still have in our hearts. Secondly, food sustainability in itself is a very important economic good, and I would say that this will certainly not diminish in the future. So being a main player economically but also politically on the world scene, it's also very important that we have a food sustainability, and this is certainly one of the goals of European policy. On the other hand, I think we should also have openness with respect to agricultural sector, and I think that the ambassador of Brazil will not deny that in fact we have that openness, isn't it, Mr. Ambassador? Thank you. Are we losing time with Singapore? Certainly not. Certainly not. Singapore accounts for 1/3 of the trade with the ASEAN countries. It's also laboratory, I think, to develop a deep FTA with respect to services, with respect to public procurement, research and development, non-tariff barriers. And we also want to put a marker on what we do in the future with the rest of the region, and that's a shared goal. It's not only the goal, one of the goals of the European Union. It's also a goal that is shared by Singapore as well. Whether we are going to discuss tax issues, that's not what I'm here for. The changes.
What is your new policies?
The changes compared to my predecessor. I have 2 predecessors in a 1-year time span. You should first of all specify which predecessor. But having said that, I'm not thinking in terms of what do I want to do because I want to do it differently from my predecessors. I'm looking to the future and see what are the needs. At this moment in time, I think the needs are that we get a deal on Doha. We should really have that deal. It would be a major mistake not to do this. And we will continue to pressure for this. I think it makes sense to have deep free trade agreements with major economic partners. I think it makes sense to dig into new sectors, and there, for example, the Lisbon Treaty that took us 9 years, isn't it, makes that we will have also exclusive competence for foreign direct investment and also for services. So we want to exploit what is possible and make progress, and we will come forward with a communication on what our policy will be in the next 5 years within a couple of months, most probably before the summer holidays. And that will be a communication on what I want to do. It will not be a communication on what eventually could be said in a critical way about what happened in the past.
Does anybody have one last burning question? We're just 5 minutes past our time. If you do have, this is your last chance to ask the question. If not, okay, quickly, if you don't mind. We're supposed to finish at 5, so very quickly.
Yes, Your Excellency. One simple question.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. My name is Ice from Innovatia. The question is that what Europe or EU learns from the disparity between the ASEAN-China FTA. And, of course, it's different dimension and perspective-wise. But in terms of qualifying balance, the question of what should and what should not be want and needs, and how do you balance it out and into a new equation for the 21 seats? Thanks a lot.
I think we should look at what are the reasons that we could not pursue this regional deal with ASEAN. Are two main reasons. First, the different degree of development. But that's probably we could have solved by a lot of flexibility in the agreement. But the other reason was that Myanmar is a non-starter in Europe. It's simply a non-starter. I will not go into the matter because everybody might have a different opinion on that, but politically speaking, you cannot go to the European Parliament with an agreement with Myanmar. It's completely impossible. First of all, I don't think it would be easy to make an agreement with them either. And what would be the degree of ambition? But apart from that, it's simply a non-starter in Europe. So all the time you put in that is simply lost time. And that's why we have turned to a bilateral approach, but with a view to come to a canvas of agreements that ultimately would have even a better result than a region-to-region approach, because when you have a region-to-region approach, and you see that also in the FTA with China, then you have to considerably lower your ambition. And maybe it's better that we calibrate the ambition to each and every individual country.
Well, I began with 3 points, so let me end with 3 thank yous from the smallest to the biggest. The smallest thank you is thank you very much for mentioning my article. Most people in Singapore had not heard of it, actually. It's in the current issue of Time magazine. And as an author, I always prefer to be criticized than to be ignored. The second point is, of course, we want to thank you for delivering a very strong, powerful message from Europe. Because frankly, I think we actually believe we need to have a stronger European voice in Asia. And we want to see more, Ambassador Holger, we want to see more European voices come and speak and participate at all levels in the school. We have faculty, we want to get students, we want to get visitors, and clearly we welcome a much greater participation here. And thirdly, of course, I want to thank you most of all for doing us a great honor. For us, for a school, which I just said goodbye to Kofi Annan literally at 2:30 today. And then at 4 o'clock, I welcome a European Commissioner for Trade. For us, getting such global figures coming to our school is a great honor, and we thank you very much for taking time off your busy schedule to visiting us. Thank you.